Good morning, everyone logged into this webcast. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Teresa Marion, the Northeast Engineering Manager of Risk Management Professionals. Just to give you a little background on our company, RMP was started in 1995 as an engineering consulting firm. We specialize in EPA risk management plans, OSHA process safety management, spill prevention control and countermeasures, and additional emergency response plans. So we kind of do it all within the safety realm for different facilities. We've worked with many industries, including oil and gas, chemical manufacturing, water, wastewater treatment, power generation, a whole list. So we've really dealt with a spectrum of facilities. We do have our corporate office located in Orange County, California, and also I head up our East Coast operations located out of Media, Pennsylvania. With that, our Pennsylvania offices do service facilities in New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New York. We kind of get around that little spectrum of states. Today we're going to be talking about the New Jersey TCPA compliance audit tips. Before we begin, I just want to go through some webcast etiquette. For those of you joined into this webcast, we're going to go ahead and keep the participants muted during the course of the presentation. And this is so that if you have background noise, it's not coming through on the presentation to other participants. In addition, at the end, we'll have a question and answer period. If you had questions and you wanted to go ahead and type them in. There's a chat window that you'll see in your lower right-hand corner. You should be able to click on that and type in your questions to my colleague, Nicole, and Nicole will go ahead and voice those over to me, and we'll get those answered. If you didn't want to ask it that way or you wanted to email me, that also works also. So let's go ahead and get started. Just so you have a little background about myself, as I said, I'm the Northeast Engineering Manager. I head up our East Coast operations. With that, compliance audits is really a strong aspect of the job I do for facilities. I get called into a lot of facilities to audit them, figure out their deficiencies, and then create an action plan on how we're going to correct those deficiencies and bring that facility up to compliance. With that, I do help a lot of facilities, and I'll gear it more towards handhold them through implementation of these programs. I've developed, I've implemented, I've updated, obviously audited RMP PSM programs, TCPA programs, a lot of these programs for different facilities, and again, the whole spectrum of different kinds, chemical manufacturing, ammonia refrigeration. Specifically on compliance audits, in the last 3 months, I think I've done close to 10 audits for facilities. So like I said, that's a strong suit of mine, and I really love the topic of compliance audits. So as I said, today we are going to discuss New Jersey TCPA compliance audit tips. The key topics I want to cover in this presentation is I want to go through first just a general introduction. We'll then get into the requirements for a compliance audit. We'll go through conducting an audit and tips and hints that I use to make the audit effective and work good at your facility. We'll then go through prevention program review tips, and during this section I'll go through each of the prevention programs and kind of give you, hey, this is what I'm looking for at facilities. And we'll end by having a question and answer period. So starting off with our general introduction, as for those, I'm sure you're familiar, in the state of New Jersey, if you are determined to have a hazardous substance on site, meeting the threshold quantities for the Toxic Catastrophic Prevention Act, TCPA, then you are required to implement a TCPA program at your site. In addition, we also have a few other programs at the federal level. So at the federal level, if you meet those threshold quantities for an EPA risk management plan, then you're also required to submit to the EPA and implement an RMP program. In addition, if you are a facility that meets the OSHA threshold quantities, well then those facilities are also required to implement an OSHA Process Safety Management Program or PSM program. With the TCPA program, the real purpose is to document that personnel are safely operating and utilizing and maintaining these processes that are considered to have hazardous material. It also ensures that management is dedicating minimum resources needed to prevent accidental release at these facilities, and that includes training, equipment and maintenance, personnel as appropriate. So for the TCPA program, there's different elements. We have a submittal requirement, a management program, a hazard assessment, the real bulk or meat of your program, which is going to be the prevention program, and then an emergency response program element. You'll see that I've noted that OSHA PSM only focuses on those prevention program elements. So this just gives you an overview of the different prevention program elements. When we talk about a TCPA program and we're talking about those different prevention program elements, this is your process safety information, your process hazard analysis, operating procedures, training. As you can see, there's a whole list of them. In addition, I've added this table to show the overlap in the regulations. Those of you familiar with the TCPA regulations will know that they very much are a copy of the EPA RMP regulations with some additional requirements. In addition, OSHA PSM for their prevention program elements are also very similar. So all these regulations are very similar in what they want in prevention program elements, and it can be easily created to meet all the requirements in one single program. Specifically of the prevention program elements, you'll see that I have on that list compliance audit. So TCPA does have a compliance audit prevention program element, and that's going to be the focus of our presentation today. So what is required of the compliance audit? Under the TCPA regulations for the compliance audit, we want to conduct a compliance audit. We want a compliance audit team that includes at least one person knowledgeable in the process. During the compliance audit, you want to document the findings. If deficiencies are found, we want to address those deficiencies, and you want to retain the 2 most recent audit reports on site. For the TCPA specific, they require that a compliance audit be conducted annually, where RMP PSM just require it be conducted every 3 years. So TCPA goes above and beyond in ensuring that you're doing that audit more frequently. So let's go through some compliance audit best practices. When you go through and do a compliance audit, yes, you are verifying that the regulatory requirements are met at your facility. But also the compliance audit should be used as a tool to determine, are these programs working effectively at my site? What do I mean by that? Hey, I may have the procedure to meet the requirements, but is the procedure actually being used? Are we properly implementing it? And that's what I mean by it also serves as a mechanism to ensure that we're effectively using this program on site. Obviously, when you go through a compliance audit, you can definitely do it internally. There's no rules against that. However, remember, when you go to do an audit, you want to remain objective. You can't be in there, do an audit, find something that maybe is not necessarily meeting the regulatory requirement and brush it under the table. We want to remain objective and ensure that we're meeting those requirements. I've also listed recommendations versus suggestions. With this point, what I want to say here is, hey, for when we go through and audit a facility, we want to ensure if we are identifying a deficiency, we have a recommendation. A recommendation is an action that's going to have to be followed up with. We're going to have to provide some closure for it. Versus suggestions, if you're going through and you're auditing your program and, hey, you're meeting the regulatory requirements, but you think this might be a good idea, this could help improve the program, and it's more suggestive in nature, well, we may want to leave those out of the audit on a little sidetracking list. And the reason why we do this is because I've been to facilities where they've got audited by a consultant or an outside person. There was a lot of suggested nature recommendations in there. Wasn't necessarily required to meet the regulatory requirements. It was just a good idea, and in that case the facility is required, if it's listed in that audit as a recommendation, to follow up. So when we do it, we want to make sure we're defining for sure recommendations to meet a regulatory requirement. With the recommendations, there's going to need tracking. We're going to have to do some follow-through. And when you go through this audit, you're not only ensuring that you're meeting the regulatory requirement, you're also verifying the record retention at the site, because these different prevention program elements are going to require that you maintain records. Training, I'm going to want to see training records for personnel. So we're verifying the records retention in addition. So if you decide, hey, it's time for me to conduct my compliance audit, well, prior to going on site, verifying the records, going through the program documentation, it's a good idea to define an agenda and schedule. I find that by developing an agenda, it helps me ensure that I have the correct people scheduled for the audit that day, and it also gives individuals an idea of how we're going to proceed through this audit the day on site. Also, scheduling in advance, again, helps that we have the appropriate individual and they can participate in the compliance audit team. When you go to conduct a compliance audit, you've heard me say a few times, compliance audit team. Well, with the compliance audit team, if you're a larger facility, you want to make sure that you're including the correct individuals. You're allowing individuals to participate in the audit. And hey, depending on the different program elements, you may want to interview different individuals. So for the team, we want to make sure that we have at least one person knowledgeable in the process, that understands the process, knows how it's working. We also want to include a person knowledgeable in the regulations and requirements. Pretty obvious, we need someone that knows what's required. In addition, you may also include the individual charged with overall responsibility of the program on site, because then he'll know or should have an idea of how that program is working at that facility. And then if you're a larger facility and prevention program elements are being delegated out, such as you have a training department, you have a maintenance department, you have an operations department, well, we may want to include an individual from each of those departments in the compliance audit team. So let's go to, so prior to conducting the audit, I went ahead, I defined an agenda, I scheduled the appropriate people. It now comes for the day of the audit. What are we going to do? Well, when you walk on site to do that audit for the first day, the first thing you want to do is lay out a sign-in sheet. This is going to help you document individuals present or interviewed during the course of the audit. In addition, I like to begin by conducting a coordination meeting. And what I find is by conducting a coordination meeting, it helps get everyone on the same page. So as we walk in to do that audit, during this coordination meeting, obviously we go through the introductions, make sure everyone knows each other. But during that coordination meeting, I'm also explaining, hey, this is what we're trying to do here. These are the requirements for an audit. This is why we're conducting the audit today. And explain it to people so they have an understanding of our goals for that day, what we're trying to find. I also use that time to explain to people, hey, we're going to be conducting interviews. We're going to be diving in and digging through that program documentation. So it doesn't help you to not tell me or be honest with me, because really you want to be able during the audit to find your deficiencies before an agency, regulatory agency comes in, because you get OSHA coming in or one of these different regulatory agencies and they find the deficiency, well, then you're getting fines, notice of violations, notice of correction. So it's good to explain this to the team. I'm diving through. help me by being honest with me if I'm asking questions. Secondly, when you're going through that audit the day on site, you want to make sure you have an appropriate method to document the compliance audit results. We're going to have to develop a compliance audit report. So in this method, a lot of people will use checklists, which we'll go through in a few slides down when I give you some examples. But we need a method to document the results of that audit and that day on site. As you go through that day of the audit, that's where we're going through the documentation review. We're doing interviews as applicable. Some facilities will choose to gather all the program documentation into one location. This can help focus time on site, focus the time needed for individuals. However, other facilities will like to, hey, leave it as is and let's dive in and see if we can actually find where this documentation's at. That's at the discretion of the facility on whether you want to gather it in one place to help smooth over the audit, or you want to see if you can actually find stuff and not gather it. On the day of the audit, so we go through, we have the individuals, we coordinated, they know why we're here, we start going through the documentation review, going through the different prevention program elements. Well, at the end of the day, I like to close by explaining, this is an initial what I found. You know, that way, when they get that compliance audit report, the facilities are not surprised if you end up having a lot of recommendations in there. I already kind of pre-warned them. Hey, I went through your facility. I hate to say it, I found a lot of deficiencies here. We have a lot of recommendations for improvement. Again, by closing and reviewing that initial findings, it gives them a heads up to what they're going to see in that report. In addition, by reviewing your initial findings, this can also lead to a brainstorming session with the team to get us in the mode to start thinking, how are we going to improve on this program at site while we have everyone there? So I kind of said it in my previous slide, but with this coordination meeting, like I said, I show up on site, we conduct the coordination meeting. We're explaining the purpose of the compliance audit. We're reviewing the covered process at this time and changes since the last compliance audit. This is going to give me an idea of what I need to be looking for in your prevention program elements to ensure that they've been updated. In addition, during your coordination meeting, you'll also review facility organization. This will help you identify, hey, these are how the program elements have been implemented at my site, and these are the people I may need to interview during that process. So as I said, we need a method to document the results of the compliance audit that day on site. A lot of people will opt to use compliance audit checklists. With compliance audit checklists, I think they're a great tool. They ensure that you're meeting every regulatory requirement and that it's addressed. It provides a record of the participants that day, and it ensures an efficient method for document the audit. In addition, that kind of helps you identify where those recommendations are applicable and what regulatory requirement they're needed for. So these are just some examples of checklists that you may use. As you know, New Jersey, the DEP, on their website, they have provided checklists that can be used for auditing the TCPA program. It's not required that you use their checklist. However, they have provided this tool. So this is an example of that. It's an Excel format. Again, it goes through every regulatory requirement, allows me to identify, have I met that regulatory requirement? So as I said, the previous slide was an example of what TCPA provided. You may have your own checklist. You don't have to use exactly the New Jersey DEP checklist. You may have it in a different format, but the whole idea is by having the checklist, I'm listing out every regulatory requirement. I'm identifying, is that regulatory requirement met? I also, in my worksheets, include comments on where I'm finding information, because this will help me have a program roadmap later for updating that program or knowing where to find different pieces of information. With the compliance audit, we have the checklist. This is providing a tool for document. I also like to include a recommendation tracking log at the end, and this just helps identify, hey, these are the recommendations, and it gives me a mechanism to track, start scheduling closure, and scheduling follow-through on those recommendations. So, as I said, compliance audit, during the compliance audit, we are reviewing the prevention program elements and the supporting documentation with the prevention program elements. When we talk about prevention program elements, it's going to be that process safety information, process hazard analysis, operating procedures, training, etc. There's a whole list of them, but the compliance audit is meant to verify that these prevention program elements are in place and being utilized effectively on site. Just now I'd like to go through some key audit insights. When I go to conduct an audit, one tip that I like to use is I like to start by asking what the changes to the process have been. This is before I dive into that management of change to verify that documentation. I want to hear it from the facility's mouth. Hey, in the last 5 years, last 3 years, since the last audit, what changes have we made to the process? This gives me an idea of what to look for as I'm going through these documents, because if major changes were made to that process, I should have followed through the elements of the program and updated it appropriately to reflect these changes. So by having a starting set in mind that these are the changes, it helps me look for those updates in program documentation. When you go through and you're reviewing these prevention program elements and different documentation, it's good to look at revision numbers, look at dates on documents. This helps you to identify if these documents are being updated, they're being utilized on site. I've listed here, we want to interview individuals. During an audit, I like to take it past just what do I have on paper. I want to go out there and I want to speak to my operators. I want to speak to my maintenance personnel. And this helps give me an idea of if they have an understanding of what TCPA even is. Do they know what this program is? And also, can they explain to me where you find these documents? Because it shows by doing that I have employee participation on site. I'm getting them involved. I've also listed spend time to gather documentation at one location. As I said previously, this is really at the discretion of the facility. If you want to save time during your audit, you may choose to gather as much of this documentation in one location as possible. However, if you wanted to walk in and just see, hey, if an inspector showed up surprisingly that day of site, could I find everything? Well, then you may choose not to gather the information in one location. Again, when we're going through and we're evaluating it, I'm going to keep on repeating this over and over. We're not only looking at the documentation, but we're looking at implementation and the effectiveness of that program on site. My goal is, hey, if we have developed these programs, they're meant to be a living, breathing document. They're not just meant to be the binder on the shelf, the paperwork in the folder. They're meant to be utilized. You're supposed to be updating it. So let's take it beyond just looking at the records and ensuring that we're having effective implementation at the facility. As you go through the audit, make sure you keep in mind, are there opportunities to strengthen this program? Are there areas where changing a procedure or changing the lines of how it's implemented, we can make improvements there? And then again, objectivity. We want to take the regulator's perspective. We want to pretend that, hey, I am DEP, I am OSHA, I am, EPA, I'm a regulator on site. What am I going to find? What are the deficiencies at this facility? With the compliance audit, as I said, we go through, we conduct the audit the day on site. I went through a coordination meeting. Everyone knows what we're doing. following the compliance audit, we need to have some closure. So following the audit, we're going to review the initial results with individuals that participated so that they can understand what the deficiencies are. We then want to brainstorm on how to improve the program and address the deficiencies on site. And here's where brainstorming helps. As I said, individuals have different ideas on how pieces of information should be implemented, what lines of authority they should follow. So by brainstorming, you're getting all those ideas out on the table and deciding what is the best application for my facility. And then if appropriate, we're going to want to, at this time, assign recommendations with target completion dates and start getting those action items scheduled for closure. So that kind of goes through, hey, we're on site, we need to conduct an audit. How do we go about that the day on site? I went through, I gave you some tips on, these are tools, these are methods that I use when I go on site, and I found over all my auditing experience, this helps focus the group and ensures that we're all on the same page, working towards the same goal. Now I want to just go through each of the prevention program elements and give you some review tips on items to look for in your program documentation. So I wanted to include this slide just to make a note. Yes, we're going to go through the prevention program. I'm going to provide you hints and tips for items to look for in each prevention program. But due to our timing of this webcast, I'm not going to go through every detail of every single prevention program element. So I wanted to put that in there so that individuals tuning in aren't like, hey, she's missing a lot of information in that prevention program element. So just keep in mind, I'm just giving tips and hints here on different items you may look for in each prevention program element, but not every single item. So our first prevention program element we have is process safety information. And with the process safety information, I always tell my facilities, process safety information is meant to, one, give me an idea of the chemical you're using at your site, the hazards associated with that chemical. Secondly, it's meant to tell me about your process. What is the inventory of your chemical in there? What are the safe operating limits? What's the process description? And lastly, it's meant to tell me specifically about the equipment. The idea is if I were a new employee coming on site, I should be able to look through this process safety information and have a very strong idea of that process and the chemical and the equipment utilized at this facility. So when we go through to audit process safety information, the first thing I said is, hey, I want to know about your chemical. Well, for most of this information, by having an MSDS for that covered chemical, it's going to meet most of the requirements. So the first thing I'm looking for is, hey, do we have an MSDS for our covered chemical? Secondly, I said, once you tell me all about the chemical, well, now let me know about the process. So in this section, I'm looking for, do you have an overview of the process? Do you have maximum intended inventory calculations, or was that calculated to tell me the inventory that you could potentially have on site of that hazardous chemical? Secondly, I'm looking at, are safe operating limits listed or referenced to the location of where this information can be? And I say reference because you're going to find that with these prevention program elements, there's some overlap in some of the requirements. Process safety information wants me to know about the safe operating limits of my process. Well, in operating procedures, I also want to know about these operating limits. So you may refer to one place and not have it in both locations. Lastly, when I go to process safety information, well, hey, you told me about the chemical. I saw you have the MSDS for that chemical. You told me about the process. Now tell me about that equipment. In this section, this is where you're going to have your piping and instrumentation diagrams and P&IDs. One thing I really like to do when I go on site and I'm auditing process safety information is I'll field verify those P&IDs. So when we get to the P&IDs, I say, hey, do you have a copy? Let's physically walk out to that system and let me trace it down. When I go out to that system, I'm taking a copy of those P&IDs and I'm just following it along the process lines, verifying that we have all the correct valves depicted. And a lot of times you'll find when you go to field verify that P&ID, hey, there may be a valve here that's not listed on the P&ID, and this field verification is helping me verify that you are keeping these current. In addition, when I'm looking at equipment information for the process, I'm looking for different elements. Did you list out the material of construction? Is there electrical classification? If you have a release system for your process, do you have calculations and an explanation of these calculations for the release system design and the ventilation design? In addition, as you know, with TCPA, they also look, hey, do we have electrical one-line diagrams that's accurate? Do we have a site plan, fire water sewer system drawings, and an external forces events data? Did I write this down? Did I evaluate this? Do I have that at least referenced in my process safety information? One thing, process safety information has a lot of different bullets that they want you to hit within that section. I like to tell facilities, hey, even if something may not be applicable to me, I like to at least list out that bullet and say it's not applicable, because you need to remember, sometimes these inspectors, auditors coming in aren't necessarily going to understand your process. They're going down their checklist and they're ensuring that you have each of those headings. If you don't, then if they don't know and they don't look in detail, it may not be necessary, but they may say you're deficient because you don't have it. And one big point where that leads into is ventilation design. So a lot of facilities, their process is outdoors. Ventilation design is not applicable. They're open to the outdoors. Their process is sitting outdoors. They're not going to have fans to ventilate that system. However, I still like to look for a heading of that and an explanation of that. Again, just in case someone's quick going down the list to make sure I hit all bullets, they'll see, okay, I at least hit the bullet. Our next prevention program element is process hazard analysis with risk assessment. So when I get to the process hazard analysis, I'm looking, did you complete a PHA? Did the team include the appropriate team members? And is this identified in a participant list with title? For recommendations stemming, from the PHA, has there been follow-up? Is there a mechanism to track these recommendations, close them out, and document this closure? I'm also looking if there's been no changes to that process. By looking at the different revalidation dates, has this been completed on a 5-year time frame? As you know, with TCPA, they are also requiring the risk assessment portion with the PHA. So for the risk assessment, I'm looking for, is there a table summarizing the off-site release scenarios that we identified during the PHA? Is there modeling, consequence modeling, identifying that we reviewed these scenarios? And then is there a risk reduction plan for reducing the risk of these off-site potentials? Our next element is operating procedures. So when you get to operating procedures, we want to verify that they're listing out and they have all the steps for each operating phase as required by the regulations. So this is going to include, when you hand me your operating procedures, do I have an initial startup? Do I have normal operations? Do I have emergency shutdown, including when it's warranted, who's qualified to do it? Do I have temporary operations? Do I have a normal shutdown? I'm verifying that each of these operating phases are identified in those procedures. In addition, when I get to operating procedures, I like to verify these operating procedures should be synchronized with what the operator is actually doing in the field. And so when I go through the audit operating procedures, I'll ask, hey, can you bring in an operator? Can I talk to an operator? I'll then tell that operator, hey, I'm not quizzing you, but I need to verify. I want to look at these procedures, see if they're really what you're doing. So I'll pull the P&ID, or I'll actually take them out to the process and say, hey, I'm going to pick a step. Will you explain to me how you would do it? I'll pick a step, say normal startup. I'll then go through, as the operator's telling me how he's doing it, I'm verifying, does that match up to what I have in my procedure? I find it very interesting that if you have good operating procedures synchronized with that operator's actions, when you go through and you start talking to this operator or asking him to explain these different phases, well, then a lot of times you'll find he'll explain to you almost word for word what's in that procedure. There are times where you go and do this and you have the operator telling you different valve numbers than what's listed in my procedure. And if that's happening, well then, hey, I'm going to have a recommendation to verify that these are accurate. But operator interview helps me to ensure that, hey, they're synchronized with his actions, and also they know where to get a copy if they need it. In addition, with the operating procedures, I'm looking for certification sheets or some mechanism to document that they've been reviewed annually. Our next prevention program element is training. So with the training, the first thing I'm looking for, is there a training program in place? Does this training program identify the different requirements for training and guidelines associated with, hey, these are the different elements that my operators are going to be trained on? In that training program, does it include an overview of the hazards of the chemical, operating procedures as necessary for the job task the operator is doing, emergency procedures as applicable? In addition, I'm looking for that training plan or program to include written job descriptions, duties, and responsibilities for each of those operators' positions. As I go through and I'm verifying this training, what I usually like to do is I first ask, can you give me a list of employees or operators that are going to work on that system? Once I have that list of operators, I then like to pick a few operators and ask the facility to pull me their training records. Once they pull their training records, this will allow me to verify, one, the record retention, that they're maintaining these training records to prove they're actually training their operators to the training program in place. And also, it helps me to verify that they're completing training as required. In the regulations, they want initial training and refresher training every 3 years. This is the minimum. Most facilities are going to do additional training into that annually or monthly or quarterly, and so they may have a lot of different training documentation. But by them pulling the training records for me, I'm verifying that they're actually completing training for their operators. Our next element is mechanical integrity. So mechanical integrity is really your preventative maintenance program, your PM program. Most facilities these days are moving towards utilizing a computer maintenance management system. There's all different kinds out there. You have Bigfoot, Grand PM, Maximo, all different kinds. But most facilities are not these days only relying on paper copies anymore. They're implementing these computerized maintenance system and using them in conjunction to daily logs, weekly logs, monthly logs for the facility. So when I go to audit a PM program, what do I do? Because this element can be quite cumbersome. With the PM program, first thing I want to verify, do you have a formal schedule of tasks? Does this formal schedule include all the equipment associated with the regulated process? Does this formal schedule, how was it created? Was it created by pulling manufacturer's recommendations and operating history? Once I've seen this formal schedule, well now, what is your means to document you're completing the task according to this schedule? And is there a method to know if there's an equipment deficiency or an operator walks out and he sees something that may not be right? Is there a way for him to communicate that back for us to timely correct it? In addition, is there a procedure to review, document, and approve delays as appropriate? So as I said, when I walk in to audit a PM program, I know, okay, say a compressor, you're going to have an oil draining, you're going to do daily logs, maybe monitor section discharge pressure, you may monitor temperatures, you may change filters annually, you're doing a vibration analysis every 6 months to annually. So I'm keeping this in mind and looking at that schedule to see if I'm seeing these tasks on there. I then walk over and say, hey, pull a maintenance guy, let me look into your computerized maintenance system. Have him walk over there. I ask him, hey, okay, so a compressor, I know you need, so-and-so task. Can you pull a compressor? Let me see the history that in your work order system, these tasks are being completed according to the schedule and closed out. And I'm looking at that history in the PM program itself. Our next prevention program element is management of change. So when you get to management of change, your first question obviously, again, has to be, has there been any changes to the covered process? If there have been changes to that covered process, and when I mean changes, not a replacement in kind, meaning I didn't change one valve for the same exact valve. I'm looking for major changes. Was piping rerouted? Did I add new control system to that? With these changes, were all elements of management of change implemented prior to making that modification or starting that process back up? So here, if there have been changes, I want to see a management of change form. I want to see where your prevention program elements were updated and documented. And I'm looking for this documentation. If there have been no changes to your regulated process, well then for management of change, you're just verifying that you have the procedures there in case you were going to make a change. Married along with management of change is pre-startup safety review. So if you go through and you make a major modification at your facility, say we are rerouting piping, I'm adding a new vessel, well, prior to introducing that regulated substance back into that process, the pre-startup safety review is my final checklist verifying that I updated all the documentation. So if I did have a major change at my facility, I'm during the audit, verifying that I have all the MOC documentation, I've updated the prevention program as necessary, I followed the management of change procedures, then I'm also looking for a pre-startup safety review form. Do I have a checklist that verifies I met all those requirements of management of change? One thing to note, so if I'm at a facility, I'm also looking, hey, do they have a new covered process? Is this a brand new constructed process at the facility? If so, I want to make sure that there's a safety review of design report, and I'm looking for this. Our next item is compliance audit. So that's what we've been speaking about today. With the compliance audit, hey, it's the prevention program that's meant to verify you're implementing the regulatory requirements, you're implementing these programs, and you're utilizing them effectively. When I get to compliance audit, I want to verify that a compliance audit is being completed annually per the TCPA requirements. And then was there a report developed? Within the report, I want to see where you documented the scope of the audit, the methodologies and techniques that you used, the participants that were involved in the audit, and then what were the results of the audit and some recommendation follow-up. Our next item is incident investigation. So when I get to incident investigation, the first thing I'm asking the facility, have we had any accidents on site? Hopefully the answer is always no, but there are cases, where you do potentially have accidents. If there has been an accident on site, I'm looking for, did they go through the proper steps of incident investigation? Did they develop a report of the findings? Communicate that to affected personnel. Is this maintained on site? If there have been no incidents at the facility, I'm just verifying that they have a procedure to investigate incidents as necessary, that the incident investigation procedure includes the requirement to start that investigation initiated within 48 hours includes the proper team members, the development of a report, and that the results are communicated to personnel. One thing I do want to note, for instant investigation, a lot of facilities, from what I've seen in auditing, will utilize a corporate instant investigation procedure. That's fine. This procedure is meant to be all-inclusive for everything. Workplace accidents, meaning individuals getting hurt, not necessarily a release of a regulated substance. So if you are a facility that has that corporate level instant investigation procedure, you will just want to double check that it includes also all the requirements of RMP PSM or TCPA RMP PSM, because a lot of the times that corporate level procedure will leave out some of the specific regulatory requirements under TCPA or PSM. Again, if you had an incident, we're looking at a report on file and that it's been retained for at least 5 years. Our next element is employee participation. So with employee participation, we're verifying that there's a written plan for employee participation. And again, these programs are not meant for management to just stick on the shelf. These programs are meant to be utilized by operators and employees at the facility. So we want to get them involved in the different elements. Through interviews, this is helping me verify, hey, do employees have access to TCPA program information as necessary? Do they have access to operating procedures? If they wanted to see the process hazard analysis, is there a way that they can get a copy to review it? I'll tell you, chances are an operator is not going to come ask you and say, hey, I want to read that process hazard analysis. However, under the requirements, they are allowed to have access if they want. So you need to have a way or a mechanism to ensure that they have access to TCPA program information. Our next item is hot work permits. So I'm finding at a lot of facilities, hot work permit is becoming pretty common across the industry. Everyone's utilizing the general hot work permit forms. They're almost all the same. So for this, a lot of facilities, you're not going to find deficiencies here. However, you still need to verify, hey, is there a procedure to issue hot work permits, and that these hot work permits are being maintained on file at the facility. Remember, under TCPA, they're going to want you to retain these hot work permits until a DEP representative looks at them and verifies that they were implemented. Our next item is contractors. So with contractors, when I get to this section, I'm first asking the facility, do you utilize contractors on site? And what I'm really looking for, have you used, excuse me, have you used or are you currently utilizing contractors to maintain the process? Are they doing work on the process or near the process? If you say yes, you are utilizing contractors to do maintenance or work on that process, well then we need to ensure that you have a mechanism or a policy to evaluate these contractors' records. With it, again, I'm looking for, do they have the forms? Have they requested from the contractor a copy of their safety programs, a copy of their injury illness logs that I can maintain on file and show and prove to someone that, hey, I verified this contractor is qualified to work on my equipment. And lastly, we have trade secrets. Trade secrets is a federal OSHA requirement only, so a lot of facilities may not have this. The idea, if you are regulated under OSHA PSM, you do want to have a section for trade secrets, and that trade secrets, I'm just verifying that there's a policy. The idea is, hey, if this was a confidential process, a secret per se process, that I am still going to allow my employees access to information so that they understand the hazards of the chemical and the process. So if you are regulated under the PSM side of it, you will want to have a policy for this. So as you go through and you review these different prevention program elements, you're going to find deficiencies. There's going to be areas where maybe you're not necessarily meeting all the regulatory requirements. As these deficiencies are found, or if you find areas where you're not meeting the regulatory requirement, well, then we want to create a recommendation for improvement. Following the compliance audit, these recommendations need followed up on, and they need a mechanism to close them out to show I'm making improvements with the program. I'll tell you, so I've audited a lot of facilities, and the most common deficiency, I mean, there's a few things that you'll usually find at every facility. It seems like a lot of facilities, their most common deficiency is addressing recommendations. As you know, recommendations are going to come from the PHA. They're going to come if you have an incident. They're going to be generated from this compliance audit. And with those recommendations, we want to have a means to follow up and provide closure for them. It's not that, hey, I made recommendations in a PHA, I'm going to wait 5 years till I'm due up for a revalidation and revisiting those. No, some of these recommendations could be safety related, especially if they're stemming from your PHA. So we want to make sure we have the means to follow up and close out these recommendations. With recommendation follow-up, so you do go to some facilities where recommendation, now the facility doesn't feel that recommendation is necessary. Under the federal OSHA requirements, they do list guidance on if you were to justifiably decline a recommendation. So you can decline a recommendation, although it's not usually suggested that you do that. However, if you found that that recommendation has factual errors, it's not necessary to protect health and safety of employees or your facility, or you find an alternative measure will work better, then you can justifiably decline a recommendation. Again, with recommendation follow-up, as you go through this audit, you're going to find deficiencies and you're going to have recommendations. With these recommendations, we want to ensure that we assign an individual responsible to follow up on this recommendation. Assign them a target completion date. And once you assign these recommendations and assign target completion dates, here's where I always joke with facilities, then we want to add in the test factor as being the TCPA Program coordinator. And what do I mean by that? You've assigned the individual responsible, you gave them a target completion date. People need reminders, so then you want to remind them, hey, that due date's coming up. Have we made any action on that recommendation? When you go through and you start closing out these action items, well, then we're going to want to document the mechanisms taken to close out this recommendation. And for any of these regulations, TCPA, PSM, it's all about documentation. For many facilities, the idea is if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. So we want to make sure we're including that and marking closure. So one thing I just want you to keep in mind, even if the facility performs all of their action items, I can walk out and see there. Again, this program is about documentation. And let's be honest, for many people, it's a documentation nightmare until you can get into the gist of it and get into the hang of it. The idea, though, is if you didn't document it, then it's a deficiency. So we want to make sure we're including documentation for closures of these recommendations. So with this prevention program, as I said, it's not meant to just be that binder on the shelf for management to show that they've implemented this program. You develop the program, you implement the different procedures. The compliance audit is going to allow you to evaluate that program. During the compliance audit, you're going to find deficiencies. I've yet to see a facility where I went to and there was not at least one recommendation for improvement. There's always going to be methods for improvement. We're going to document and correct those deficiencies, and it's meant to be a living cycle that keeps on going and going. In review, we went through a lot of information in this presentation, and thanks for sitting with me for this hour and talking about compliance audits. As I said, it's one of my more dear topics. I really like compliance audits. With this in review, remember, when you go to do a compliance audit, you want to make sure you have the appropriate team members. We want to make sure that we have a document or a method to document the results of the compliance audit. We want to ensure during our audit that every regulatory requirement is met. This is going to require me to not only look at the procedures, but also review supporting documentation to ensure the facility is maintaining proper records on site. In addition, I've said it 1,000 times, I'm not only looking, do they have the procedures in place? I'm also looking at implementation. This is my time to find and correct deficiencies before that regulatory agency comes in. So highlighted in red, strong point, make sure you're objective. You might be auditing your own program if you're doing it internally. You might have developed the TCPA program at your site, but you want to be objective even if you're auditing your own work. And with the recommendations, remember, they require follow-up. We're going to need a method to follow up on document closure of these. So that's it. We'll now open it up. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and, as I said earlier, type it into your chat window, and Nicole will let me know if there's anything you want me to answer. If you do not feel comfortable asking questions in this forum, you can always go ahead. My email's listed and my contact information, and you can always feel free to contact me. If I'm at a client site, it may take me a day to get back to you, but I always try to get back to individuals with questions.
Okay, so looks like it's kind of a quiet morning. We don't have any questions at this time.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you everyone for joining in this morning and listening to me talk about compliance audits.
You have a good day. We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.